Yeah, first thing is, and believe it or not, it has been 31 years, and I did start as a director. It was a great opportunity to come back home. So, I was off working in Minnesota for a couple of years before I got a chance to come back home. And, what a great privilege it is to come back and serve your own home community. Largely what I'm going to be talking about today, we'll touch on the flood, we'll cover the flood, that we're going to watch that video. I'm assuming some of you might have already seen, but it is such a powerful piece that I think it just kind of helps set that stage, and it's only a portion of the video that really the journey has helped create, just as the commemoration piece. And so we're going to run a small portion of that. I'm going to talk about Monsignor's involvement with the flood, and we'll talk about that piece, but we're going to talk well beyond that. Really, we're going to talk about priest, servant of God, servant of his brothers and sisters, and of all creation. And it seems like that's kind of a great global kind of piece to talk about, but more and more as I've followed in his footsteps pretty much most of my life. That's probably the best way to say it. Was here in 1970 from 1972. And so Monsignor was my first pastor that I remember when coming back to Rapid City. And so I grew up sort of under his wing. And we'll talk a little bit about what that experience was like. And in terms of what he was about as a human person, because I'm going to tell you, too often I think we live amongst giants in our midst, and we don't recognize them. We don't see them. And we don't see how they inspire and transform the world in which we live. They're just ordinary people, and they do extraordinary things, and they do that in a persistent way throughout a lifetime. And it's certainly transformational. But the piece with Monsignor is just, really in many ways we're very fortunate to have him, because he wasn't born here. And he didn't originally study for this diocese. But we'll get into his history a little bit more as we move forward. But 1931 to 2014, certainly there's some of you that know him well beyond my experience, because mine really starts, like I say, in the early 70s. But we're going to start out with that video that just that sort of introduces the flood and reminds us of really what that was about. And many of these faces are people, some of them are gone now. Many of them are gone now. But I'm assuming those of us who have lived in Rapid City, many of us will know these names and faces. And you'll begin to see what I started experiencing as I was preparing for this, I think. Monsignor was actually born in Chicago, Illinois, and from a very young boy, his greatest desire was to be a priest. And he literally went to a high school seminary way back in Chicago, and then moved forward, and then went to what we call college level seminary. And it was while he was there that he contracted TB. And he had TB pretty bad, and literally he had got pulled out of school. And he went to go back to school. He somehow finished his senior year, but he went to go back to school and wanted to study further. The Diocese of Chicago denied him the ability to study for priesthood, because way back in those days, in the 1950s, you could not be a priest if you were not, quote, a whole man. And Monsignor had lost one of his lungs. And so when he continued to pray, and he went through a period of real depression. For those of us that know him well, and I would talk to him about this, he would say, I knew this was the reason for which I was born. And I had this obstacle I couldn't figure out a way around. And so finally he started talking to some people, and he said, well, maybe some missionary diocese somewhere would consider you as a candidate. And so he came to South Dakota, and he met a man named Bishop McCarthy, and I think their Irish connections probably were helpful. But Monsignor went out and he spent some time on the reservations in western South Dakota, and he fell in love with the Lakota people. And he wanted to come to do missionary work. He had a deep love for Native people. And that carried throughout his entire ministry, his whole career. But he was allowed to study here and was finally ordained in 1957. And he held a number of different offices in the diocese. I mean, from chancellor to vice chancellor, but I would say the most important role that Monsignor ever had was he was a pastor to all, and particularly the poor. And it didn't matter to you if you were Catholic or not. He didn't care. You were a child of God. And you deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. And he had a particular interest in people who were disempowered. And you can see that in the list of things that show up, from dealing with tribunal and AIDS task force and the campaign for human development, disaster recovery, and Catholic social services, and those pieces that keep carrying forward. And the funny thing is, I just knew him as my pastor, and I knew him like this. was a little boy going to middle school and trying to go my way through. My dad died when I was 8. And so Msgr knew me from when I lived here earlier in life, when my dad died and I was in 2nd grade. Msgr actually went out and just went to the funeral because he'd heard about a widowed woman who lost her 5 children. And so he literally came. Didn't know me from Adam, but walked up to me as an 8-year-old boy and he said, "Now listen, you need to know this. The fact you've lost your father gives you a particular right to call God your father. And you can call on him, and you can count on him. If there's something I can do for you or your family, here's my number." That was just who Msgr O'Connell was. He was that way for most people. And those of us that know him would find out that when someone came down with cancer, all of a sudden Msgr would show up at their door. Or if he had heard about someone who had a tragic death or loss, he would just show up. And that's just who he was. So that title to me is probably the most important title right here. Pastor to all, and particularly the poor. But he also knew a lot of people, both wealthy and poor. And it always amazed me when I would go out with him, like we invited Billy Mills here, our Olympic champion that won the 10,000 meter race or whatever it was. We invited him here to come to help us with our Lakota Circles of Hope program. And Billy Mills came, and when he walked in, he said, "The primary reason why I'm here, because I assume I'm going to see Msgr O'Connell." And I said, "What? How do you know Msgr O'Connell?" And he and Msgr were just good friends from all their time at Crazy Horse. And again, Msgr would talk to him about, you better watch out because you've got a particular, again, you're orphaned. Billy Mills was an orphan child. And Msgr would always tell those folks who had experienced that they have a particular right and a particular role. And then they have a particular responsibility as we got older, he would tell us, to try and go and do the same. And so here's Billy Mills seeking out Msgr at our event. But that's just kind of the nature of who he was. The flood pieces, I would say to you, primarily what he was sort of the pastor of Cathedral, associate pastor of Cathedral, and he resigned from that role immediately after the flood, and he went into full-time disaster recovery. He was both chancellor and associate pastor at the Cathedral, and he resigned from both those, like I said. So he started immediately trying to figure out what can we do to help with the recovery. And these are some pieces that most people probably haven't seen because they probably don't see the Catholic extension, but they did a huge fundraising layout for the Diocese of Rapid City to help us with our recovery, and particularly our recovery not only of church facilities, but more importantly of our Native community. And so this piece you read up here, this kind of reminds us of what we lost, and there's a lot of rumor and rumbling about this number, and particularly in the Native community, there are many people, and I've heard multiple times, that we say, 238, I think is what we've come to as the final number. And Native people say there were also other Native people and children who were never accounted for. And so they suggest that memorial might be missing a few names. And whether it is or not, the reality of this piece is over 1,000 injured. Now think about the hospital and where the hospital was located at the time. What a devastating blow to our city, huh? 700 dwellings, 500 mobile homes, 1,900 buildings were lost. And we look at the damage to vehicles and the reality of all that. And here's the biggest challenge that most people don't know about. Insurance officials state that 13 million of the $100 million of damage back in 1972 costs would be covered by insurance. If you ever do disaster work, and I've done it for all 30 years that I've been at Catholic Social Services, the one thing you'll find out is the worst disaster. Pray for a tornado. Pray for a fire. Pray for any other form of disaster, but the one form of disaster you don't want to have is a flood, because it's covered by nothing. 90%, as you can see, almost 90% of what was lost in our city, was not covered by insurance. And that meant what? Government comes in and helps, but again, you're going to find out there's a lot of misnomers. Like people sit there and think, oh, well, you lost a house to a disaster. Well, the federal government will rebuild it. No, they won't. Not in a flood. They won't flood. The insurance won't rebuild it. And the pittance you'll get even today, The maximum house allowance comes from FEMA. The rest of it comes out of your pocket on a loan. Is about $35,000. Now I don't know. Anybody here want to raise their hand to say, "Oh, I could replace my house for $35,000"? Not going to happen. So most of that money comes out of blood, sweat, and tears and real human beings who make personal sacrifices and contributions from volunteers that help lead recovery to fixing and repairing and trying to get something structurally back to where it's functional. And obviously you're never going to do that completely. But out of this reality, and there's a couple more of these, and then we'll talk a little bit about what came out of Rapid City. So really, this is that piece that Monsignor really wanted us to think about again. You know, it's this piece of reality that, you know, Father Collins died and there was great loss. It was a sad reality. Father Collins was a priest. Those of you who know what happened and lived along the creek bed was primarily a lot of low-income housing neighborhoods and a lot of native communities that lived there. That's really where originally what we know as St. Isaac Jogues, that center was all along that creek bottom. And so Father Collins is who got caught up in that. This whole facility down here used to be basically the community center for Native people, much like the Mother Butler Center is now. The parish, there was a feeding program that was present there. There was also at that time a free medical clinic that the Benedictine sisters used to run out of this facility. So that demolition was a huge piece. Literally, this Father Collins, when you read about it, you'll find out that basically he was holding an event down at this community center when the flood started coming, and he encouraged everyone to go home and to leave. In fact, he told many Native people not to go home and to seek out higher ground. And I suspect that probably saved some people's lives. But he stayed to try and finish the dishes, clean up, and get the building closed. And unfortunately, he died in that disaster. This is that recovery effort that we were talking about. So literally the extension started doing some things in other organizations, but largely Monsignor was smart enough to say, hey, we've got 2 large facilities in Rapid City that primarily do education, and this is in June. Let's open those up as homeless shelters. Let's set those up so that we can begin to bring in some groups to do recovery, and let's begin with some distribution. So literally that's what you see here. Got to go back. Got to go forward. So what you see here is actually pictures of people who are from Mennonite Disaster Services. And they would come in as a group and they would start working with applications. And it's a really funny way that this worked. All the church communities came together. And literally whatever donations came in, they were responsible to help try and allocate. And they set up something called disaster case management. And what disaster case management meant is you would come in to apply for assistance, telling them what you've lost, what you have to help recovery, if you have insurance coverage, all those kind of things, who you are, if you have a disability, if you're elderly, if you're a single parent trying to provide for your family, all those things would be scored. But they would all go into a blank file. And then they would go before this whole community coalition, so Monsignor wouldn't know to help only the Catholics, and the Methodists wouldn't know who were the Methodists, and the Lutherans would, and you wouldn't know if this person was Native American or white or Hispanic. All that information was suppressed. You had a case number with what was lost and what the needs were, and Monsignor set that up deliberately along with the other folks to begin to say, we know that the Native community is disproportionately impacted, and we don't want to be accused of being racist, discriminatory, or limiting our aid or assistance to anyone. We're going to do this completely in the blind. That pattern, what they set up, is now followed in 50 states throughout the country and 70 foreign countries. That's what we know as VOAD. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. But these are the volunteers. You have volunteer labor to fix and repair, to do whatever they could. And anyone that knows anything about the Mennonite Disaster Services, they are still about the most effective, most efficient responder to disaster in the entire Midwest. They should be incredibly proud, but I will tell you, every religious group was very, very similar. And that was one of the things that I'll tell you, you would see throughout Monsignor's lifetime. When he ran into those pastors that served on that board, and community leadership that served on that board, there was a natural affinity and connection that lasted their entire lifetime. And I think that's what happens in the midst of disaster. It's kind of like the band of brothers that we think about in war, in times of war. You develop a relationship you'll never forget. His connection with people like Stan Adelstein, those will never change. His sense of respect for those folks that stepped up to the plate and did some things. This is what VOAD is now. As you can take a look, 1970, 7 national disaster response organizations convened for the first time to think of a better way to respond effectively to disaster and disaster responses. Do you know who called that meeting? And that meeting still happens every single year. That meeting still happens every year. And we still coordinate, collaborate, and those basic traits and characteristics that were originally the founding. And again, this is one of those deals that I go to a national meeting to learn about disaster recovery, and I have 3 people to walk up to me and sit there and say, "Do you know Monsignor O'Connell?" And I went like, "What? I'm in Philadelphia." The only reason why we have VOAD in the United States of America is because Monsignor O'Connell started it. And you're going like, and these are all the old timers. And you take a look at what happens now. Look at the number of volunteers, almost a million volunteers. Look at the number of hours, and look at the amount of money that donated labor in response to disaster recovery, and that's in 2019. Literally, the things that started here have national and international impact and flow out of the disaster of a flood in 1972. This is just a quote that I really should read because I think it's pretty clear. You know, Monsignor was always calm in the middle of a storm, and that's our Mayor Barnett speaking. One of those storms came in 1972 with a murder, and so we'll talk a little bit about the reality of what happened in the AIM movement and what happened locally. But he also talks about here Monsignor O'Connell's group helped victims and helped lead an international or interdenominational church disaster response. Anyone recognize disaster response in that name in town? We still have a church response in our community that still flowed out of that reality. And to address those people who lost their home, but we're going to see a little later that vision is much bigger. When we look at what happened here, you know, and basically Barnett says that essentially Monsignor's role here was so critical in preventing the disaster, and the reason for that relationship is in the Native community after the flood. Monsignor's prioritization and willing to not discriminate carried through in the midst of what was an armed, literally for those of you who don't know, and I didn't know these things until years later, we had literally AIM move from Custer to Rapid City, and they were looking to create a whole crisis and upend this city in a way that would have been incredibly difficult. And really, Mayor Barnett and Monsignor and about 3 other of our law enforcement folks that stood in a gap and that kept calm, remained patient, was willing to listen. It would not be escalated into violent responses, nor allow the police is reason why we aren't Mississippi burning in Rapid City, South Dakota in 1973. Their patience and commitment to say, this city will do better. The city can own that we do struggle, that we do have problems. And I would say that's still true today. Our willingness to be introspective, to own our stuff, and to look for ways to build pathways of brotherhood and relationship across the board in our city. Just before Monsignor died, literally we had the shooting of the young man at the Civic Center and the unrest that happened with regards to the kids at the hockey game that got poured upon. Monsignor came down very, very quickly and he said to me, "Jim, be ready. We are on the verge of what happened in 1973 again. And as a community, you need to be prepared, and all of our leaders in our community needs to be prepared to figure out how to manage these situations so we come out better, not bitter." Those kind of realities continue today. And if people haven't read this book, it is a very good book about the Rapid City history between 71 and 73 when Mayor Barnett was, and for some of you, I saw that you were here when he was here and spoke. But I would highly recommend that book because you're going to find some of those folks like Hennies,
some of those people like Tom Lane that you saw in there, you'll learn about the heroic founders, refounders of our city, I would say. A refounding of our city. But these are some of Monsignor's accomplishments. Boards and leadership, both locally. He served on Crazy Horse Memorial Board for a number of years. Served at West River Mental Health, which is now Behavior Management Systems. Had a real strong affinity, you can see it here as well, for people with behavioral health or mental health issues or substance abuse issues. Served on many boards. I still run into people that tell me that they started their sobriety with a fifth step with Monsignor O'Connell. Pretty incredible. Played a very active role, obviously, in the mayor's racism reconciliation work, the church disaster response and helping to create that, the Association of Christian Churches, which still endures today. Nationally, he was an advisor on social policy and social issues to the United States Catholic bishops. He served on Catholic Charities' board of directors for disaster response, would get called out for decades afterward when Iowa would go through a flooding. They would send Monsignor down to teach the basic VOAD, Case Management 101, and how to do this. In Kentucky, in the Philippines, literally, across the world, Monsignor continued to do that kind of work. President of the Committee for the Elderly, the President's Committee, actually he was appointed by the President to serve on that national board, was a member of the Catholic AIDS Network nationally, served in the Church World Service as a consultant. Church World Service, again, is not a Catholic organization. It's primarily a Protestant organization. But again, Monsignor would never see those lines and walk right across them. This one was one that I just learned about. I didn't know this. It was Niagara Task Force, and this was an environmental task force addressing toxic waste in waterways in the United States back in the 70s and 80s. So care for creation was also just a part of who Monsignor was. Understanding, this group played a huge role in detoxifying the Lake Erie in front of Chicago. In another city where it was in Pennsylvania somewhere where they had a river that literally started on fire. He was a part of the leadership that began to set federal regulation or promote federal regulation being established to clean those kind of waterways. Awards, obviously Distinguished Citizen for the City of Rapid City multiple times. Liberty Bell Award from South Dakota Bar Association. And you'll see over here our Founders Award that we've named him in his honor, and some of his best friends. Some of them I'm trying to hurry to get through, like Ozzy. If I don't get to some of these, I fear that if I die and I see Monsignor somewhere, he'll kick my butt from here to eternity. So some of those folks are still folks who I feel like I have to try and reach out to. Certainly our building was named after him. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a little while. Outstanding Service Award to the Black Hills State, named Monsignor actually in 1995 by Pope John Paul II. Again, an award he would generally not have been called a Monsignor, didn't want the title, didn't need the recognition, preferred not to be called that. His bishop ordered him to accept the title and to go by that name. That's just kind of how Monsignor was. But this would be his proudest moment. This is what he said: I thank Almighty God for the multiple graces and favors which he has enriched my life, and I'm most grateful to him for sharing in the gift of Christ's priesthood, an honor I am most unworthy of, and yet for which I have been called. He would talk literally about those days when he didn't think this was going to be what he would be allowed to do. And his sense of being unworthy, he couldn't insist that he be ordained because he knew as a human person he was unqualified. And not a bad sense of self-esteem, but a real sense of what it is to try and be an image of Christ in the world. And the overwhelming responsibility that would be. And he would explain to me as I was a young father, that was my job. That was my job. Having an awareness of that, the Lakota have a beautiful way of saying it. Being conscious of the fact that we're human beings, but we are spiritual beings living in a physical world. A real sense that first and foremost, we're an image of God in the world. And that is how we respond and react out of that life. That was who Monsignor O'Connell was. Monsignor O'Connell, just that man of humility, and I'm just going to give you that example. You know, back in 2013, we were trying to buy our building. And so I went to Monsignor, I asked him to serve as our honorary chairman because literally he was dying of cancer. And he had had cancer off and on multiple times, but he literally knew that he wasn't going to make it. But I went to ask him to do this because I simply knew Monsignor's name would draw many, many donors. And he was in the throes of what he referred to as his brother cancer, which seems like a really strange way to think about the world. But just as St. Francis talked about the wolf being his brother, Monsignor would talk to me even in his later stages of his dying spiral, that God has yet something to teach him. That this disease of cancer is somehow going to bear fruit and be a good thing. And that he had to accept humility. And for the first time in some ways in his life, accept service from others. And allow people to care for him in the way that he had lived. And he just called that a great humility. That he would talk about this disease, not in hatred, but as brother cancer. And this is literally, we had decided, because we were struggling to raise what we needed to raise. And so someone said, well, why don't you do naming rights? And I sat there and thought, this is the craziest thing in the world, but okay, naming rights for our building. So someone called me on the phone, good friend of many of you who happen to probably sit in this room, but called me on the phone and anonymously said, Jim, I want naming rights. And I kind of thought, wow, really? Okay, I wouldn't have expected that from this person, but okay, yeah. Okay, and so I said, and so what do you think the name should be? And he said, it should be the Monsignor William O'Connell Family Center. And I said, well, I'll call Monsignor and just check to see if he's okay with that. And he said, well, you tell Monsignor this. If he says no or refuses that, I'm withdrawing my offer. And so I call Monsignor on the phone, and Monsignor breaks down, and he literally starts crying. And he says to me, you can't do that. And I said, well, Monsignor, I don't know what you want me to do. Do you want me to argue with the donor? Because I think he's pretty clear. And I said, Monsignor, I'm afraid you're just going to have to be humble enough to accept this honor. And Monsignor, still crying, says this statement: I've only done what I ought. That's become my personal mission statement. I've only done what I've ought. God has overwhelmed me with blessing. And I've been able to share that with others. What a great thought. This is a little piece from Mother Teresa, and we're closing in on being done. And Mother Teresa says it this way: none of us, including me, will ever do great things. We can all do small things with great love, and together we can do something wonderful. It's that persistence. It's that consistency. It's that day by day doing what we ought more often than we don't, huh? But in Monsignor last will and testimony, which he had read at his funeral, and I would just read some small parts of it. I think it communicates the kind of person I think Monsignor is and was. I, Monsignor William O'Connell, a priest of the Diocese of Rapid City, South Dakota, being fully aware of the time this document is being read, it is only through the most gracious and kind Almighty God that I am allowed to pay the penalty for my sins. And this is what he asks, these things. May those who have experienced lack of charity from me now give what I could not give them. May those who bore the brunt of my anger now show mercy to me. May those who I have ignored or neglected because of my pride now in their humility remember the one who had offended them. May those who have been scandalized by word or deed of mine remember the weakness of this man and praise the goodness of God. It's just that kind of philosophy. So what Monsignor would say is, I'm not a saint. I need your prayers. even at this point in my life, even in my moments of departure. Monsignor's humility and sense that none of us operate perfectly, that none of us are a perfect image of God, and his willingness to be humble, even in his own death and dying, to ask people for forgiveness of him, for the many sins that he believed that he committed. And that's the piece, though, is this sense of being unworthy and living a life of gratitude. It's out of that. And every once in a while when I get frustrated or impatient, Monsignor would just kind of kindly remind me of my own sin. Having a confessor like that, who doesn't let you get arrogant or high on your horse or when you get on your soapbox, reminds you that you yourself, it is going to be that great Our Father, right? Forgive us our trespasses as we have forgiven others. Very simple, humble man. This next video is just the video that's really is closing. He's dying. And so literally we're in the middle of that fundraising campaign, and we're actually at the point where we're going to make a big transition. And we videotaped this, and in some ways I didn't really realize how powerful I think this piece is in terms of what Monsignor brings to the table. He'll talk about the flood, and he'll talk about CSS. It's not about CSS. It's really an invitation for all of us, no matter where we're at, to live a life of service and dedication and gratitude for what we've received, and to share whatever that is for those future generations. I think this video helps capture that.
In the small rural communities, the vast reservations, and the communities in the hills, there's no place that Catholic Social Services isn't willing to go to help people who need our help as an agency. I just am grateful to God that it continues the way it does.
Following the flood of 1972, the pastors of community churches came together to form Church Disaster Response to meet the many needs of flood victims, with Monsignor William O'Connell as the director. About 6 months after the flood, Bishop Dimmerling gave Monsignor O'Connell a new and daunting task: create an Office of Catholic Charities to meet the needs of the community, not just where the flood was, but all of western South Dakota. The Daughters of Charity came to help identify those needs.
It was all done on a shoestring budget, and they were somewhat exhausted from their travels across the vast diocese, the vast western South Dakota territory. But that's the seed of where Catholic Social Services came from. And it's always been, how do we meet the needs of the people? No, not how do we meet the needs of Catholics or Lutherans or Presbyterians or Congregational, but how do we meet the needs of all of the people? As we look at Catholic Social Services today, it is certainly where it is because of the sacrifices that so many people have made. And if people continue to do those sacrifices, then the good work that God has begun will continue serving the people in western South Dakota. And I'll be very, very happy wherever I am when I see that.
Just gives you a good flavor, huh? And like you say, it's not about my office. It's about each one of us here. Stand on the shoulders. You were here in the midst of this. You did a lot of the recovery. And I know many of you know Monsignor, and you know flood stories that will certainly be worthy of. But the most important thing is for us to come back to that whole sense that we are given much and we are meant to give. So Monsignor and many of these good people have taught us for a lifetime. Do what you ought. Do it with consistency. And have confidence that those seeds that you scatter, like Monsignor, will change young people like me when I was a kid. Now, I thought about priesthood. I even pursued it for a while and realized this is what I was called to do. But Monsignor, when I came out, reminded me of this. Jim, I don't care what you do. I'm not here to tell you should be a priest. I'm here to tell you, though, you're to serve God and your neighbor with your whole heart, mind, and soul. And if you do that, you'll have the most rewarding life possible. That's why we're here. to honor a gift of a man and many of our community leaders, then to go forth and be that in the world. So I'd like to just close with a prayer, and then we'll allow some time. Maybe we should ask questions, any comments, thoughts, any stories that you guys might have to share about, whether it be Monsignor or someone else from our community that really has raised up for you.
Part of history, I think, important is Father O'Connell's first parish was St. John the Baptist, which is at Honolulu St. Teresa, and it's not it's by the church either. Jim and Jack Purcell stood up in 1958 because they knew their name Teresa and their pastor.
Yeah. I mean, those are, the contact with people, limited sometimes, has tremendous impact if we live a life of love. Yeah. That's exactly how I got to know him as his pastor. This is another one of those class examples. I'm in 7th grade, and I was starting the story, and I ended it. I forgot to finish it. 7th grade, and I'm going to class, and the teacher just had told me, now listen, next week we're all going to meet, and all the boys are supposed to come with their dads, and all the women are supposed to come with their moms. And I went to serve Mass that morning, and Monsignor walked up to me, and he said, I understand you guys are doing some kind of sex education kind of thing over at the parish. And I said, yeah. He said, could I be your dad? Showed up. 6 straight weeks. 6 straight weeks. Walked into that room, and let me tell you, everyone's jaw hit the floor. And Monsignor proudly sat with me day after day, week after week. That's the kind of person he was. You know, and there's other examples. I mean, just so many of them. I mean, Dennis Dugard talks about this great story. His mom and dad went to every single concert, every violin thing he ever did. He said they just showed up day after day after day after day. And they were 100% deaf. That's what love looks like. That's what love looks like. It's concrete, it's real. It's laid out in time and service. Any other stories, pieces? Okay, I just know Monsignor would want us to close with a prayer, and we'll close with that Our Father together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. For thine is the power and the kingdom forever and ever. Amen. Holy Spirit, amen. Thank you very much, and very grateful. There's some pieces here, just, you know, as the last will of testament. There's the Rapid City Journal article, and then those are the people who have received his award. So God bless you, and thank you. Have a great day. All right.